Would you play an arcane mage in the Riot MMO? Hello summoners and welcome. So recently we've been talking about a lot of news regarding Trials of Twilight and the now complete roster of 2xKO. But I wanted to turn to talk about something that Riot's been pretty quiet about lately, yet assures us it is in development. Of course, I am talking about the upcoming MMO. And if you're like me, you can't wait to get your hands on it and are eager for any news about what it's actually going to be like. Now, Riot has told us that their release date for the MMO is sometime before 2030, so we should be exploring Runeterra sometime in this decade. Yeah. This does still leave us with a lot of questions regarding quests, combat, locations, character creation, loot, and given that Riot has set such a far off release date, I'm guessing they're probably still in the planning phase of the project. But even with news of the MMO far off, I still can't help but wonder what's in store for us when it finally comes. Now, one of my favorite parts of any kind of RPG is making a character, particularly classes. I just think they give you such agency with what kind of a character you want to be and provide so much flavor for how you'll interact with the world. And with League's vast roster of champion playstyles, there is no shortage of potential classes for the MMO. And that might actually pose a big problem. With a roster totaling almost 200 champions now, the decision of what and what not to include as a playable class can be a daunting one for Riot. Give us 200 classes so that we can all match our favorite champion is obviously impossible. But realistically, I think we can expect something like this from the MMO's class system. So my theory is that classes will be less specific than a Wuju Master or Hextech Sharpshooter. Instead, I think Riot will take a more general approach and keep things tied to League's primary game roles, making our classes Assassin, Fighter, Mage, Marksman, and Tank. I decided to drop Support because I think this would likely show up across different subclasses rather than as a full class on its own. And then once we have our main classes together, each could provide more options through their subclasses. Now, this is where those champion playstyles start to come in, and I think each class would probably have at least 3 subclasses at the game's launch, with Riot always able to add more with updates. Now, there are many possibilities for subclasses, but having looked over the champion roster, I picked out some common threads that could come together to make a spread of subclasses that I think would satisfy most players. So first, let's take a look at the Assassin class. Obviously, this is going to be the pick for players who will want that stealthier, high DPS attack vibe. So here's what I came up with for subclasses. First, we have the Ninja. Now, this is our most straightforward, stealthy subclass, built around characters like Akali, who make use of invisibility effects and high agility. Then we have our Blade Shadow. This would be the less stealthy, high DPS assassin build, drawing from champions like Talon and Katarina. As such, this subclass is set up for high lethality with more vulnerability to balance it out, resulting in a glass cannon type build. And lastly, we have the Reaper. Now, I don't mean that every Reaper player is going to be Kayn with a scythe, but this subclass would be the most fighter-like of the 3. Reaper would be the least stealthy of the assassin subclasses, but would compensate with lifesteal abilities to self-sustain. Now we can talk fighters. These will be your more typical warrior builds for players who just want to charge in dealing damage. These would probably be popular, so variety here is important. Let's start with Brawler. Brawlers are themed after fist-fighting champions like Set, Vi, and Lee Sin. Think heavy hitters that need to be right in the thick of it to be effective, and they would absolutely have some power throws to pummel enemies. They would be the most limited range-wise, but likely the tankiest in terms of HP. Blade Master. Built around sword champs like Master Yi, Yasuo, or Yone, Blade Masters are meant to be the weapon fighters of the MMO. Now, they wouldn't be confined to only swords, but would likely make use of other lighter weapons like spears, or even dual-wield weapons like Yone with certain upgrade paths. This is likely the fastest of the subclasses, and more of the high DPS for already high DPS type build. Then lastly, we have the Skirmisher. Now this is more of a hybrid subclass, where players make use of up-close weapons while also being able to fall back and resort to ranged attacks. Of course, for sake of balance, these ranged attacks would still be pretty short-ranged, but still provide an invaluable mobility and pokiness when fighting bosses. Champs like Xayah, Callista, and Draven mostly inspired this one, and while those are ranged champions, they are still using weapons that would be highly effective at close range, justifying these alternate fighting styles. Now here we have the big bruisers, the tanks. Now tank is already a pretty self-explanatory role, so I tried to widen its net a bit to provide some variations of what a tank build could be. Bastion. Bastions are the defensive tanks, leading the charge in team modes like raids and becoming an impenetrable fortress with damage shirking abilities. Obviously this is modeled after defensive champs like Braum, Leona, and Galio. Then we have Paragons. This will be the more support tank. They boost and heal like a Bastion, but with a focus more on sustaining themselves with self-heals and buffs. They would also have a bit more of an aggression factor, with more offensive abilities than Bastions. These are heavily borrowing from champions like Garen and Tryndamere for that unkillable Vanguard feel. Conqueror. Now of course not all tanks are defensive, and this is the subclass for that more aggressive tank build. Conquerors are modeled after tanky fighters like Darius and Aatrox, meant to provide a more rolling siege playstyle than a defensive wall. They would have heavy line breaking attacks and perhaps even temporary vulnerability to withstand the heat of battle. Now we get to mages. Mages are one of the most diverse classes in the game, so their subclasses have a lot of potential. Maybe too much. So for that reason, I decided to focus on 3 general roles to allow for more leeway in spell variety. Life Mage. These of course will be the healer and supporter subclass, the go-to for all players who want to be sustaining the team in the middle of a raid. Of course luck serves as an inspiration here. Arcane Mage. Of course we would have to mention Arcane eventually, but the show's popularity aside, it did establish the magical force of the Arcane as the canon understanding of magic in Runeterra, so it makes sense that the Arcane would be used for a mage subclass. This would be the control subclass, meant to set up traps and status effects to deny areas or turn the room into your own magical chessboard. Champions like Mel and Victor would fit this role and give people an idea of what they'd be playing. Wrath Mage. Now for those who want a darker, more DPS mage experience, there is the Wrath Mage. Drawing inspiration from Veigar in particular, these mages would be all about draining and weakening enemies, maybe with more lifesteal capabilities. But like Veigar, they would certainly use tactics to immobilize and annihilate their foes. Lastly, we have the Marksman. This would be the ranged fighter class for every player who thinks swords are boring and axes are barbaric, and instead want to deal with their problems from afar. Our first subclass for Marksman is the Gunslinger, of course modeled after Lucian and Misfortune. This would be the mid-range dual wielder who dispatches foes in a hailstorm of bullets, or light or musket shot or whatever else your guns use. They of course sacrifice combat range, but gain a higher DPS than their fellow subclasses, making them very effective in close quarters. Sharpshooter. Now of course everyone having watched Arcane will probably want to break out Caitlyn's Piltover Peacemaker and snipe some enemies from a safe distance. And naturally, Sharpshooter is the class that lets you do just that. While they would surely be slower firing, they would more than compensate with unprecedented range and high accuracy, making them a danger that enemies don't notice until it's too late. And for our last Marksman subclass, we have the Blaster. Of course, this is our explosive subclass using blast weapons like a cannon, definitely influenced by Tristana. Effectively, this will work as the Grenadier build, with mid-range to keep them out of the blast zone, while wreaking havoc on enemy clusters. And that is our last subclass. Now, those 5 classes I think would handle any playstyle a player could ask for. If you can come up with any more subclasses, which I encourage you to do so, I promise it will fit within at least one of those 5 classes. And with all these subclasses outlined, I'm curious. If the MMO was to launch tomorrow, what would you start playing with? For my first choice, I'd probably go with a Blade Master, but I'd love to know your pick. Make sure to let me know in the comments below, and if you like this video, then be sure to hit subscribe. I'll be making more videos talking about the MMO in the future, and you don't want to miss them. I really hope I'll see you here again. And until that fateful day when we finally see the MMO unveiled, I'll see you out on the Summoner's Rift.